Broken Western Journey. Josephine Jo Hollis had always played it safe, never betting more than she could afford to lose. But when Cass Rollins slid a deck of cards toward her, his smirk slow and knowing, she knew she was in trouble. He leaned in, fingers brushing against hers. "You got two choices, sugar," he murmured. "Walk away, or take a gamble on me." Chapter 1. The Weight of Dust and Decisions. The desert wind whipped at Josephine Jo Hollis's skirts, carrying with it the fine, gritty dust that seemed to permeate everything in Redemption, Arizona. It clung to her worn leather boots, settled in the creases of her faded calico dress, and tasted faintly of regret on her tongue. She stood on the warped wooden porch of the general store, the midday sun beating down with a relentless ferocity that mirrored the turmoil in her heart. 58 years she'd lived, and most of them had been spent trying to outrun the ghosts of her past. Now, they were catching up, their whispers carried on that same unforgiving wind. Jo shaded her eyes with a calloused hand, her gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering horizon. The mesas rose like ancient sentinels, their rugged faces etched with the stories of centuries, silent witnesses to the struggles and triumphs of those who dared to call this harsh land home. She'd always found a strange solace in their stoic presence, a reminder that even the most formidable obstacles could be weathered. But today, the solace felt thin, a fragile shield against the storm brewing within her. The letter crinkled in her pocket, a tangible representation of the debt she'd tried so hard to forget. Her brother, Daniel. Always the reckless one, the charmer, the one who could talk his way out of anything except, it seemed, this. He'd written from some dusty, forgotten corner of Texas, his usual breezy tone laced with a desperation that chilled Jo to the bone. He was in deep, owing money to men who wouldn't hesitate to collect, one way or another. And he was calling on her, his ever-responsible older sister, to bail him out. Again. Jo sighed, the sound lost in the wind's mournful howl. She loved Daniel, she did. But his recklessness had always been a weight around her neck, a constant drain on her meager resources and her even more depleted emotional reserves. She'd spent her life picking up the pieces he'd shattered, sacrificing her own dreams, her own chances at happiness, to keep him afloat. She ran a hand through her hair, the once vibrant auburn now streaked with silver, a testament to the years of worry and hardship. Her face, though lined, still held a trace of the beauty that had once turned heads in her youth. But the sparkle in her hazel eyes had dimmed, replaced by a weariness that went bone deep. The general store door creaked open behind her, and the scent of coffee and spices spilled out, a momentary distraction from her troubles. Martha, the store owner, a stout woman with a kind smile and a heart as big as the Arizona sky, stepped onto the porch. "Penny for your thoughts, Jo?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. Martha had seen Jo through more storms than most, had offered a comforting shoulder and a listening ear countless times. Jo managed a weak smile. "Just the usual, Martha. Just the usual." Martha studied her friend's face, her brow furrowed with concern. "Daniel?" Jo nodded, the single word heavy with unspoken history. "What's he done this time?" Martha asked gently, already knowing that whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. Jo pulled the letter from her pocket, the paper worn and creased from being read and reread. "He's in trouble. Deep trouble. He owes money, a lot of money." Martha took the letter, her eyes scanning the frantic scrawl. She pursed her lips, her expression grim. "This is bad, Jo. Real bad." "I know," Jo said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do. I don't have that kind of money." Martha handed the letter back, her gaze filled with a mixture of sympathy and something else, something that looked almost like pity. "You've always been there for him, Jo. Always. But maybe it's time to think about yourself for once." The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Jo had spent so long putting Daniel's needs first that the thought of prioritizing her own felt almost selfish. "I don't know, Martha," Jo said, her voice laced with doubt. "He's my brother. I can't just let him drown?" Martha finished, her tone surprisingly sharp. "Joe, you've been drowning for years, trying to keep him afloat. When does it end?" Joe didn't answer. She looked back at the horizon, the vast expanse of desert stretching out before her, a metaphor for the uncertain path that lay ahead. She had a choice to make, a decision that would determine not only Daniel's fate but her own. She could continue down the well-worn road of sacrifice and self-denial, or she could choose a different path, one that might lead to her own redemption, even if it meant leaving her brother to face the consequences of his actions. The weight of that decision pressed down on her, heavy as the dust that swirled around her, a constant reminder of the life she'd lived and the life she might yet choose. The sun beat down, unforgiving and relentless, as Joe Hollis stood at a crossroads, the wind whispering secrets of the past and the uncertain promise of the future. The choice, she knew, was hers and hers alone. And whatever she decided, her life, and the lives of those around her, would be forever changed. Chapter 2. A stranger's smirk and a bargain struck. The Lucky Horseshoe Saloon was, as its name suggested, a haven for those seeking fortune, or perhaps, more accurately, a place to drown their sorrows when fortune failed to smile. The air was thick with the mingled scents of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and desperation. Sawdust covered the floor, attempting and failing to absorb the spills and the stories of countless broken dreams. Joe pushed open the batwing doors, the hinges groaning a protest that echoed her own reluctance. She'd never been one for saloons. Her life had been spent in the quiet corners of redemption, tending to her small garden, mending clothes, and offering a helping hand to her neighbors. The boisterous, unpredictable atmosphere of the Lucky Horseshoe was alien to her, a world of shadows and whispered secrets that she'd always avoided. But Daniel's letter had forced her hand, pushing her into this unfamiliar territory, searching for a solution to a problem that seemed insurmountable. The saloon was dimly lit, the only sources of illumination being a few flickering oil lamps and the weak sunlight that filtered through the grimy windows. A haze of smoke hung in the air, obscuring the faces of the patrons, making them seem like figures in a half-forgotten dream. A piano player in the corner hammered out a mournful tune, the melody a soundtrack to the quiet desperation that permeated the room. Joe scanned the room, her gaze searching for she wasn't sure what. A miracle, perhaps. A way out of the impossible situation she found herself in. Her eyes landed on a group of men gathered around a poker table in the back, their faces illuminated by the glow of a single lantern. They were a rough-looking bunch, their clothes dusty and worn, their expressions hardened by years of living on the edge. One man, in particular, caught her attention. He sat with an air of casual confidence, his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the other players with a predatory intensity. He was younger than the others, perhaps in his late 30s, with a lean, muscular build that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His hair was dark, almost black, and fell across his forehead in a way that was both careless and captivating. He had a strong jawline, shadowed by a day or two of stubble, and a mouth that seemed perpetually curved into a smirk, as if he knew a secret that no one else did. This was Cass Rollins. Joe felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of interest, quickly followed by a wave of apprehension. She knew, instinctively, that this man was dangerous. He exuded an aura of recklessness, of someone who lived by his own rules, who wasn't afraid to take risks. And yet, there was something about him, something in the way he held himself, in the intensity of his gaze, that drew her in. As if sensing her scrutiny, Cass Rollins looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the smoky expanse of the saloon. His smirk widened, a slow, deliberate gesture that sent a shiver down her spine. He held her gaze for a moment, his eyes, a startling shade of blue, seemed to pierce through her defenses, seeing straight into the core of her being. Then he nodded, a slight inclination of his head that was both an acknowledgement and a challenge. Joe hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she should turn around, walk away, and find some other way to help Daniel. But something held her rooted to the spot, a strange mixture of fear and fascination. She took a deep breath, stealing her resolve, and started walking towards the poker table. The other players barely glanced at her as she approached, their attention focused on the game. But Cass Rollins watched her every move, his eyes never leaving her face. As she neared the table, he leaned back in his chair, his smirk still playing on his lips. Well, he drawled, his voice a low rumble that sent another shiver down her spine. What have we here? A lost lamb straying into the wolves' den? Jo stopped a few feet from the table, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated by his mocking tone. I'm looking for someone who can help me, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Cass raised an eyebrow, his amusement evident. Help you? And what makes you think any of us are in the helping business? I need money, Jo said, the words blunt and to the point. A lot of money. And I'm willing to negotiate. The other players chuckled, their eyes flickering between Jo and Cass. Cass himself remained silent for a moment, his gaze assessing her, weighing her words, her desperation. Then he leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. Negotiate, huh? He said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. And what exactly do you have to offer, miss?
Hollis, eu sou plead.
Josephine Hollis. And I'm offering myself. The laughter died down, replaced by a stunned silence. Cass's smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of surprise? Curiosity? Jo couldn't quite read it. Yourself? He repeated, his voice still soft, but with an edge of something else, something that made her skin prickle. I'm a good worker, Jo said, her voice trembling slightly. I can cook, clean, so I'm not afraid of hard work. Cass leaned back again, his eyes sweeping over her, taking in her worn dress, her calloused hands, her tired but determined expression. He let the silence stretch, drawing out the tension, making her wait. Finally, he slid a deck of cards across the table towards her, his smirk returning, slow and knowing. You got two choices, sugar, he murmured, his fingers brushing against hers, the contact sending a jolt of electricity through her. Walk away, or take a gamble on me. Jo stared at the cards, her mind racing. She'd never gambled in her life, had always considered it a fool's game. But now, faced with the desperation of her situation, with the weight of Daniel's debt pressing down on her, she felt a strange sense of inevitability. This was it. This was her chance. She looked up at Cass Rollins, his blue eyes burning into hers, challenging her, daring her. She saw the danger in him, the recklessness, the hint of darkness that lurked beneath the surface. But she also saw something else, a flicker of something that might be respect, or perhaps even something more. She took a deep breath, the scent of whiskey and smoke filling her lungs. She reached out and took the cards, her fingers trembling slightly. I'll gamble, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Cass's smirk widened, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver of both fear and excitement down her spine. He'd hooked her. He knew it, and she knew it. The game had begun. The weight of her decision settled upon her, even heavier than before. A bargain was struck, not in ink, but in the silent understanding that passed between them, under the dim lights of the Lucky Horseshoe Saloon. The future had shifted, pivoted on this single, reckless moment. Chapter 3. Echoes of a Life Left Behind. The ride back to Jo's homestead was a silent one, punctuated only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the occasional snort of Cass's horse, a magnificent, muscular chestnut named Diablo. The sun had begun its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape, painting the mesas in hues of orange, purple, and red. The beauty of the scene was almost painful, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Jo's heart. She sat stiffly on the wagon seat, her hands clutching the worn wooden edges, her gaze fixed on the dusty track ahead. She hadn't spoken a word since leaving the Lucky Horseshoe, her mind reeling from the events that had transpired. She'd gambled her life, her future, on a stranger, a man who exuded danger and an unsettling charisma. Cass rode alongside the wagon, his presence a constant, unsettling reminder of the bargain she'd struck. He didn't speak either, seemingly content to let the silence stretch, to let her stew in her own thoughts and anxieties. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as if expecting trouble to appear at any moment. Joe stole glances at him, trying to decipher the enigma that was Cass Rollins. He was a closed book, his expression unreadable, his thoughts hidden behind that perpetual smirk. She wondered about his past, about the events that had shaped him into the man he was. He carried himself with an air of confidence, of someone who had seen and done things that most people couldn't even imagine. But beneath that hard exterior, Joe sensed a vulnerability, a hint of something lost, something broken. As they neared her homestead, a small, weathered structure nestled at the foot of a towering mesa, Joe felt a pang of something. Regret? Nostalgia? Fear? She wasn't sure. This place had been her sanctuary for years, a refuge from the harsh realities of the world. It was a humble dwelling, a single room built of adobe bricks, with a small, fenced-in garden where she grew vegetables and herbs. It wasn't much, but it was hers, a testament to her independence, her resilience. Now, she was bringing a stranger into this sanctuary, a man who could potentially disrupt everything she'd worked so hard to build. She was taking a risk, a huge risk, and the consequences of failure were almost too terrifying to contemplate. Cass reined in Diablo as they reached the homestead, his eyes sweeping over the property, taking in the details. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, and walked towards the wagon, his spurs clinking softly on the hard-packed earth. "This is it?" he asked, his voice devoid of any discernible emotion.
"You nodded, hello outside."
"It's not much," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cass shrugged. "It's home," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "And that's more than some have." His words surprised her, a hint of understanding in his tone that she hadn't expected. She climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long ride. She stood for a moment, looking at the homestead, seeing it through Cass's eyes. It was small, insignificant, a speck of dust in the vastness of the desert. But it was also a symbol of her strength, her determination to survive, to make a life for herself in this unforgiving land. "Come on," she said, her voice firmer now. "I'll show you around." She led him inside, the interior of the homestead dim and cool after the harsh sunlight outside. The room was sparsely furnished, a bed in one corner, a small table and 2 chairs in the center, a wood-burning stove against one wall. A few shelves held her meager possessions, a collection of books, a few chipped plates, a faded photograph of her and Daniel as children. Cass stood in the center of the room, his presence filling the small space, making it seem even smaller. He looked around, his eyes taking in every detail, his expression still unreadable. "It's cozy," he said, his voice neutral. Joe couldn't tell if he was being sarcastic or genuine. She busied herself lighting an oil lamp, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I'll make some coffee," she said, her voice a little shaky. She needed something to do, something to distract her from the awkwardness of the situation, from the overwhelming sense of uncertainty that hung in the air. As she prepared the coffee, pouring water from a pitcher into a battered tin pot, she could feel Cass's eyes on her, watching her every move. She tried to ignore him, to focus on the task at hand, but his presence was too powerful, too unsettling. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "tell me about your brother." Joe paused, her hand hovering over the coffee pot. She hadn't expected him to bring up Daniel so soon. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "He's complicated," she said, choosing her words carefully. "He's always been impulsive. He makes bad decisions, gets himself into trouble. But he's my brother. I can't just abandon him." Cass nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Loyalty," he said, the words sounding almost like a question. "A valuable trait. But sometimes it can be a weakness." Joe bristled at his words, a flicker of anger rising within her. "It's not a weakness," she said, her voice sharp. "It's family." Cass raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I didn't mean to offend," he said, his voice smooth. I understand loyalty. I've seen it, lived it, and I've seen it betrayed. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Jo looked at him, her anger fading, replaced by a sense of curiosity. She wanted to know more, to understand the story behind his words, the scars that he carried. The echoes of a past she could only guess that swirled between them. He had spoken of betrayal, of loyalty's double edge. She had lived it, too, but in a different, quiet way. Now, their two very different worlds were colliding, brought together by a gambler's debt and an unspoken, fragile agreement. This small, dusty homestead was now the stage for a new, uncertain chapter. Chapter 4. Beneath the desert moon's cold gaze. The coffee was strong and bitter, mirroring the taste of the situation Jo found herself in. They sat at the small table, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, creating an illusion of intimacy that was both comforting and unsettling. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but it was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and uncertainties. Cass leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying Jo over the rim of his tin cup. He'd shed his dusty jacket, revealing a worn, dark blue shirt that clung to his muscular frame. The sleeves were rolled up, exposing forearms tanned by the sun and crisscrossed with faint scars, each one a silent testament to a life lived on the edge. So, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small space. Tell me about this debt. How much does your brother owe? Jo hesitated, the question bringing the harsh reality of her situation back into sharp focus. She'd been trying to push it to the back of her mind, to focus on the immediate present, but she couldn't avoid it any longer. $5,000, she said, the words sounding almost unbelievable, even to her own ears. It was a fortune, an amount of money she couldn't even dream of possessing. Cass whistled softly, his eyebrows raised. That's a hefty sum. What did he do, rob a bank? Jo shook her head, a bitter smile playing on her lips. He's not a bank robber. He's a gambler. A bad one. He got in over his head, made some bad bets, and now he's in trouble. And these men he owes, they're not the forgiving type? Jo shivered, the image of Daniel's frantic letter flashing before her eyes. They're dangerous. They'll do whatever it takes to get their money back. Cass nodded, his expression grim. I figured as much. $5,000 buys a lot of trouble in these parts. He took another sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. Jo felt a strange mixture of fear and something else. A flicker of hope, perhaps. She was placing her trust in this man, this stranger, this gambler with a haunted past. It was a reckless gamble, but she felt she had no other choice. So, what's the plan? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Cass leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. The plan, he said, his voice soft but firm, is to get your brother out of this mess. And to make sure they never bother him. Or you, again. His words sent a shiver of anticipation down her spine. She didn't know how he intended to accomplish this, but she sensed a determination in him, a willingness to fight, that gave her a sliver of hope. How? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Cass smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I have my ways, he said. Let's just say I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty. He stood up, his movements fluid and graceful, and walked over to the window, looking out at the darkening landscape. The moon had risen, casting a pale, ethereal glow over the desert, illuminating the rugged mesas and the vast, empty expanse that stretched out before them. This land, he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. It's beautiful, isn't it? But it's also unforgiving. It takes what it wants, and it doesn't give back easily. Jo joined him at the window, her gaze following his. She'd always found solace in the beauty of the desert, in its stark simplicity, its raw power. But tonight, she felt a sense of unease, a premonition of danger lurking in the shadows. It's my home, she said, her voice firm. I've learned to live with it, to respect it. Cass turned to her, his eyes searching hers. And you're not afraid? He asked. Jo met his gaze, Her chin lifted in defiance. "I've faced fear before," she said. "I'm not afraid of hard work or of standing up for what I believe in." A flicker of admiration crossed Cass's face, his smirk softening for a moment. "I believe you," he said. "You're stronger than you look." He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers rough against her skin, sending a jolt of electricity through her. It was a fleeting touch, barely a whisper, but it left her breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. "Get some rest," he said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." He turned and walked towards the door, his spurs clinking softly on the wooden floor. He paused at the threshold, looking back at her. "And Joe?" he said, his voice barely audible. "Don't worry. I'll take care of it. I always collect my debts." With that, he stepped out into the cool night air, leaving Joe alone in the small, lamplit room, her mind racing, her heart filled with a mixture of fear, hope, and a strange, unsettling attraction to the man who had just promised to save her brother, and perhaps, in doing so, change her life forever. The desert moon hung high above, a silent witness to the unfolding drama, its cold gaze reflecting the uncertainty and the danger that lay ahead. The bargain had been sealed. The consequences were yet to be revealed. Chapter 5. The Price of Freedom, the Cost of Trust. The dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, a breathtaking spectacle that Joe usually savored. Today, however, the beauty felt hollow, overshadowed by the weight of the impending journey. She had barely slept, tossing and turning in her narrow bed, her mind replaying the events of the previous day, questioning her decision, her sanity. Cass was already up, tending to Diablo, his movements efficient and practiced. He glanced at her as she approached, a slight nod serving as his greeting. He didn't speak, and Joe didn't press him. The silence felt less heavy this morning, more expectant. They ate a simple breakfast of dried meat and biscuits, the food tasting like ash in Joe's mouth. She forced herself to eat, knowing she needed her strength for whatever lay ahead. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of their unformed partnership hanging between them. As they prepared to leave, Cass handed Joe a small, leather-bound pouch. "Keep this safe," he said, his voice serious. "It's part of the payment." Joe took the pouch, her fingers brushing against his. It was surprisingly heavy, the weight of its contents a tangible representation of the risk she was taking. She didn't open it, didn't need to. She knew what it contained. Money. A portion of the funds Cass intended to use to settle Daniel's debt. They rode in silence for most of the morning, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, a seemingly endless expanse of rock, sand, and scrub brush. Joe felt a sense of isolation, of being utterly alone in this vast wilderness, despite Cass's presence beside her. As they rode, Joe found herself studying Cass, trying to glean some insight into his character, his motivations. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He seemed completely at ease in this environment, as if he belonged here, a part of the landscape itself. "Where are we going?" Joe finally asked, breaking the silence. Cass glanced at her, his smirk playing on his lips. "To find your brother," he said. "And to have a little conversation with the men he owes money to." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She knew this conversation wouldn't be a polite exchange of pleasantries. It would be a confrontation, a test of wills, and she feared the outcome. What if they refused to negotiate? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Cass shrugged, his expression unconcerned. "They'll negotiate," he said, his voice confident. "One way or another." They rode on, the sun climbing higher in the sky, beating down on them with relentless intensity. The heat was oppressive, making Joe's clothes stick to her skin, her throat parched and dry. She longed for the cool shade of her homestead, for the quiet simplicity of her life before Cass Rollins had entered it. As they neared a small, dusty town nestled in a narrow canyon, Cass reined in Diablo, his eyes narrowing. "This is it," he said. "Silver Creek. Your brother's supposed to be holed up here." Jo felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. Silver Creek was a notorious haven for outlaws and gamblers, a place where the law held little sway. It was the kind of town she'd always avoided, a place of danger and uncertainty. Cass dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, and helped Jo down from her horse. He handed her Diablo's reins. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. "I'll go find Daniel, and I'll deal with the situation." Jo wanted to protest to go with him, but she knew she'd only be a hindrance. She was out of her element here, a liability in this dangerous game. She nodded, her throat tight with fear. "Be careful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Cass smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I always am," he said. He turned and walked towards the town, his spurs clinking softly on the hard-packed earth. He moved with a confidence, a swagger, that both intimidated and fascinated Jo. He was a man who walked on the edge, who thrived in the shadows. And she had entrusted her brother's life, and her own, to him. Jo watched him disappear into the dusty streets of Silver Creek, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a profound sense of vulnerability, of being completely at the mercy of events beyond her control. The price of Daniel's freedom was high, and the cost of trusting Cass Rollins was still unknown. She could only wait, and pray, and hope that he would return, that he would keep his promise. The silence of the desert pressed in on her, broken only by the distant sounds of the town, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just around the corner. The sun beat down, baking the earth. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. Chapter 6. Shadows of the past, whispers of the future. The wait was agonizing. Jo paced back and forth beside the horses, her nerves frayed, her imagination running wild. She pictured Cass confronting Daniel's creditors, a tense standoff, a violent confrontation. She imagined the worst, her brother injured, or worse. Cass, she couldn't bear to think about it. The sounds of Silver Creek drifted to her on the wind, the raucous laughter from a saloon, the occasional shout, the distant rumble of a wagon. Each sound heightened her anxiety, fueling her fears. She strained her ears, listening for any indication of trouble, any sign that things had gone wrong. She clutched the leather pouch Cass had given her, the weight of it a constant reminder of the stakes. She finally opened it, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside, neatly stacked, were several bundles of banknotes. It was a significant amount of money, enough to make a difference, to start anew. But it was also blood money, in a way, earned through gambling, through risk, through the very activity that had landed Daniel in this mess. Jo closed the pouch, her heart heavy. She'd spent her life avoiding this kind of world, the world of easy money and dangerous men. She'd valued honesty, hard work, and simple living. Now, she was caught in the middle of it, forced to rely on a man who embodied everything she'd always shunned. She looked out at the vast, unforgiving landscape, the mesas rising like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long and dark across the desert floor. She thought about her past, about the choices she'd made, the sacrifices she'd endured. She'd always put Daniel first, had always been the responsible one, the caretaker. Had she done the right thing? Had she enabled his recklessness, his inability to face the consequences of his actions? A wave of regret washed over her, a bitter taste of what might have been. She'd had dreams once, of a different life, a life filled with love, with companionship, with a family of her own. But those dreams had faded, replaced by the harsh realities of caring for a troubled brother, of scraping by in this desolate land. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, a figure emerged from the dusty streets of Silver Creek. Jo's heart leaped into her throat. It was Cass, walking towards her with his usual confident stride. He was alone. Relief washed over her, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. He was alive, he was unharmed. But her relief was quickly replaced by a new wave of apprehension as she saw his expression. It was grim, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Where's Daniel?" she asked, her voice trembling. Cass stopped in front of her, his gaze searching hers. "He's gone," he said, his voice flat. Joe's heart sank.
Gone? What do you mean, gone?
He left Silver Creek a few days ago, Cass said. He got wind that his creditors were closing in, and he ran. Joe felt a surge of anger, mixed with a profound sense of disappointment. Daniel had run again, leaving her to face the mess he'd created. She'd gambled everything on him, on his supposed desperation, and he'd betrayed her trust once more. He just left? She asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Cass nodded. He left a note. For you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, handing it to Joe. She unfolded it, her hands shaking. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's, a hasty scrawl filled with his usual charm and excuses.
I'm sorry.
I can't face them. I'm heading north, to Montana. I'll make it up to you, I swear. I'll send for you when I'm settled.
Don't worry about me.
Joe crumpled the note in her fist, her anger giving way to a deep, aching sadness. She'd been a fool. She believed him, had trusted him, and he'd let her down again. I don't understand, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Why would he do this? Cass shrugged, his expression sympathetic. He's a gambler, Joe. He's always running from something. From responsibility, from consequences, from himself. His words resonated with a painful truth. Joe had known this about Daniel, had always known it, but she'd refused to accept it. She'd clung to the hope that he would change, that he would finally grow up and take responsibility for his life. So what now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What about the debt? Cass's expression hardened. The debt is still owed, he said. But it's no longer Daniel's problem. It's mine. Joe looked at him, confused. Yours? What do you mean? I made a deal, Cass said, his voice low and intense. I told them I'd take care of it. I told them I'd pay them back with interest. He looked directly into her eyes, and a promise is worth more than gold out here, Joe. A shadow of the future flickered between them. Joe, a woman burdened by another's debt. Cass, a gambler honoring an obligation made in a dusty town. He'd taken on Daniel's burden, shifting the weight from her shoulders to his.
But why?
The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, as the shadows of the past mingled with the whispers of a future yet to be written. Chapter 7. A dance of defiance and desire. The journey back to redemption was a stark contrast to the outward trip. What had been filled with anxious anticipation was now laden with a complex mix of relief, resentment, and a burgeoning, unsettling awareness of the man riding beside her. Jo was no longer simply a woman seeking to rescue her brother. She was a woman indebted to a gambler who had, for reasons she couldn't fathom, taken on another man's burden. Cass, for his part, was even more taciturn than usual. He rode with that same watchful alertness, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, but there was a new tension in his posture, a subtle shift in his demeanor that Jo couldn't quite decipher. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, wrestling with the implications of the deal he'd struck. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, Cass finally broke the silence. "We'll make camp here," he said, gesturing to a small, sheltered alcove at the base of a towering mesa. Jo nodded, grateful for the respite. She was physically and emotionally exhausted, drained by the day's events and the roller coaster of emotions she'd experienced. They unsaddled the horses, built a small fire, and shared a meager meal of dried meat and hardtack. The silence between them was no longer comfortable, but it was charged with an unspoken energy, a palpable tension that crackled in the air like static electricity. As they sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces, Jo found herself studying Cass, trying to understand the complexities of his character. He was a paradox, a man of contradictions. He was a gambler, a risk-taker, a man who lived by his own code, yet he had shown her a surprising degree of kindness, of generosity.
"Why?"
she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it? Why did you take on Daniel's debt?" Cass looked at her, his blue eyes piercing in the firelight. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I told you," he said, his voice low. A promise is worth more than gold. Jo shook her head. That's not a good enough answer, she said. There's more to it than that. You barely know me. You don't know Daniel. Cass leaned back, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. I know you're a woman of your word, he said. I saw that in the saloon when you offered yourself as collateral. That takes courage. And I respect courage. He paused, then added, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. And I know what it's like to be in debt. To owe someone more than you can ever repay. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Jo sensed a story there, a painful chapter in his past that he was reluctant to reveal. She wanted to ask him, to probe deeper, but she held back, sensing that he wasn't ready to share that part of himself. But you're a gambler, she said, changing the subject slightly. You thrive on risk. How can you value a promise so much? Cass smiled, a wry, self-deprecating smile. Gambling is about more than just luck, he said. It's about reading people, about knowing when to hold, and when to fold, It's about understanding the odds, and about honoring your commitments, even when the cards are stacked against you. He looked at her, his gaze intense. I made a promise to you, Jo, and I intend to keep it. His words sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to attraction. She was drawn to his strength, his confidence, his unwavering sense of honor, even if it was a twisted, unconventional kind of honor. As the night deepened, the fire began to die down, the embers glowing red in the darkness. The desert air grew cold, a stark contrast to the heat of the day. Jo shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Cass noticed, and without a word, he stood up and retrieved a blanket from his saddlebag. He came over to her and draped it around her shoulders, his touch lingering for a moment, sending a jolt of warmth through her. Thank you, she said, her voice soft. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. The firelight flickered in his eyes, illuminating the depths of his gaze, revealing a hint of something that looked almost like tenderness. For a long moment, they stood there, locked in a silent embrace, the only sounds the crackling of the dying embers and the whisper of the desert wind. The air between them crackled with an undeniable tension, a magnetic pull that drew them together. It was a dance of defiance and desire, a delicate balance between fear and fascination. Jo knew she should move away, should put some distance between them. But she couldn't. She was caught in his gaze, mesmerized by his presence, drawn to the dangerous allure of the man who had, in a single day, turned her life upside down. He was a gamble, a risk, a leap of faith. And she was, against her better judgment, starting to fall. The desert night held its breath, watching, waiting. The embers glowed, mirroring the heat that was building between them, a silent promise of a fire yet to be kindled. Chapter 8. The Unforgiving Land, the Unyielding Heart. The next few days were a blur of hard riding, meager meals, and fitful sleep. The landscape they traversed was as varied as Jo's emotions vast, open plains that stretched to the horizon, rugged canyons that echoed with the whispers of the wind, and towering mesas that cast long, imposing shadows. The unforgiving land mirrored the internal struggle Jo faced, the constant battle between her ingrained sense of caution and the growing, undeniable pull towards Cass. He remained an enigma, revealing little of himself, yet his actions spoke volumes. He was a skilled tracker, navigating the treacherous terrain with ease, always alert, always watchful. He was a provider, ensuring they had enough food and water, even when supplies were scarce. And he was, surprisingly, a protector, shielding Jo from the harsh realities of the journey, taking on the most difficult tasks without complaint. Jo found herself observing him, studying his movements, his expressions, trying to decipher the man beneath the rugged exterior. She noticed the way he handled his horse, with a gentle firmness that spoke of respect and understanding. She saw the way he scanned the horizon, his eyes constantly searching for danger, a testament to his vigilance. And she felt the way he looked at her, a gaze that was both intense and protective. She also began to see glimpses of the vulnerability he kept hidden, the cracks in his armor. There were moments when his usual smirk would fade, replaced by a look of weariness, of sadness. There were times when he would stare out at the vast emptiness of the desert, his eyes filled with a longing that mirrored her own. One evening, as they were making camp near a small, trickling stream, Joe decided to confront him, to try to break through his defenses. They had eaten their meager meal in silence, the tension between them palpable. "You said you knew what it was like to be in debt," she said, her voice soft but firm. "What did you mean by that?" Cass looked at her, his blue eyes guarded. He hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to answer. "It's a long story," he said, his voice low. "I have time," Joe replied, her gaze unwavering. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I wasn't always a gambler," he said. "I had a different life once. A family. A ranch." Joe's heart skipped a beat. This was a side of him she hadn't seen, a glimpse into a past that he clearly kept hidden. "What happened?" she asked gently. Cass looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I lost it," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "I made some bad choices, trusted the wrong people. I ended up owing a lot of money, more than I could ever repay. I lost everything." His words resonated with Joe's own experience, with the sacrifices she'd made for Daniel. She understood the pain of loss, the bitterness of betrayal, the weight of a debt that seemed impossible to escape. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. Cass shrugged, his usual smirk returning, but it was a weak, forced gesture. "It was a long time ago," he said. "I've learned to live with it." "But you haven't forgotten," Joe said, her gaze searching his. He met her eyes, a flicker of something raw and vulnerable in their depths. "No," he said softly. "I haven't forgotten." He stood up, his movements abrupt, and walked over to the horses, checking their saddles and hooves. Joe watched him, her heart aching for the pain he carried. She realized that his gambling, his risk-taking, was more than just a way to make a living. It was a way to escape, to numb the pain of his past, to keep the demons at bay. And she, by accepting his help, had inadvertently become a part of that escape, a reminder of the life he'd lost and the debt he still carried. The weight of that realization settled upon her, heavy and unsettling. She was bound to him, not just by Daniel's debt, but by a shared understanding of loss and the enduring power of the past. The landscape stretched vast and empty around them. The wind sang its lonely song. He worked, she watched. The unforgiving land was a witness, and the unyielding heart, hers and maybe his, was a participant in this strange, uncertain dance. They were two souls, scarred by the past, searching for redemption in the vast emptiness of the desert. Chapter 9. Scars that speak, wounds that bind. The closer they got to redemption, the more the landscape shifted, the harsh, open desert giving way to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and juniper. The change mirrored a shift within Joe, a growing resolve to face whatever awaited her, tempered by an increasing awareness of the complex bond she was forming with Cass. One afternoon, while resting beneath the shade of a sprawling cottonwood tree, Cass surprised Joe by initiating a conversation, a departure from his usual taciturn nature. "You've been quiet," he observed, his eyes studying her face. "Thinking about your brother?" Joe shook her head. "Not just him," she admitted. "Thinking about everything. About this whole situation, about you." Cass raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his expression. "Me? What's there to think about?" Joe hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "You're a puzzle, Cass Rollins," she said. "You're a gambler, a man who lives on the edge, yet you've shown me kindness, generosity, even compassion. I don't understand you." Cass smiled, a wry, self-deprecating smile. "I'm not sure I understand myself," he said. "I'm a man of contradictions, I guess. I've done things I'm not proud of, things I regret. But I also believe in second chances, in redemption." His words resonated with Joe, echoing her own longing for a fresh start, for a chance to escape the mistakes of the past. "Do you believe in second chances for everyone?" she asked, her voice tinged with a hint of hope. Cass met her gaze, his blue eyes intense.
Not everyone, he said.
Some people are beyond redemption, but some deserve a second chance. And I think you're one of them, Joe. His words sent a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. She was drawn to his honesty, his willingness to acknowledge his own flaws, his belief in the possibility of change. What about you? She asked, her voice soft. Do you believe in a second chance for yourself? Cass looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He was silent for a long moment, as if wrestling with a difficult question. I don't know, he finally said, his voice low and troubled. I've made a lot of mistakes, hurt a lot of people. I don't know if I can ever make up for that. Joe reached out and touched his arm, her fingers lingering on his skin. It was a spontaneous gesture, a moment of connection that surprised both of them. We all make mistakes, Cass, she said. It's what we do afterwards that matters. It's whether we learn from them, whether we try to be better. Cass turned to her, his eyes searching hers. He reached out and gently touched a scar on her hand, a faint, white line that ran across her palm, a memento from a childhood accident. This scar, he said, his voice a low murmur. It tells a story. It's a reminder of pain, but also of healing, of resilience. Jo nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She'd never thought of her scar in that way. It had always been just a mark, a reminder of a clumsy mistake. Cass traced the scar with his fingertip, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. We all carry scars, Jo, he said. Some are visible, some are hidden, but they don't define us. They're just reminders of what we've survived. He looked at her, his gaze intense. And you, Jo Hollis, are survivor. You've weathered storms that would have broken most people. You're strong, resilient, and you deserve happiness. His words were a balm to her wounded soul, a validation of the strength she'd always tried to maintain, despite the hardships she'd faced. She felt a connection to him, a deep, unspoken understanding that transcended their differences, their pasts. It was a bond forged in shared pain, in mutual respect, and in a growing, undeniable attraction. The scars that spoke of their past were becoming threads that bound them together, weaving a tapestry of shared experience and a fragile hope for a future they might, just might, be able to build together. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their pasts and the promise of what might be. The setting sun painted the sky in fiery hues, a backdrop to a moment of profound connection, a turning point in their journey. Chapter 10. Between a rock and a hard place, a choice is made. They arrived back in Redemption under the cloak of a late evening, the town shrouded in a silence that felt both familiar and unsettling. The familiar scent of dust and wood smoke hung in the air, a reminder of the life Jo had temporarily left behind, a life that now seemed a world away. The Lucky Horseshoe Saloon was still bustling, its raucous sounds spilling out into the quiet street, a stark contrast to the peaceful solitude they'd experienced on their journey. Cass reined in Diablo in front of Joe's small homestead, the structure looking even more weathered and fragile than she remembered. You should stay here tonight, Jo said, her voice hesitant. It's late, and she trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. The truth was, she didn't want him to leave. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to his quiet strength, to the unsettling but undeniable attraction that simmered between them. Cass nodded, his eyes meeting hers. I will, he said, his voice low. They unsaddled the horses, the familiar routine providing a sense of normalcy in the midst of the uncertain situation. Jo led the way inside, lighting the oil lamp, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls. The small room felt both comforting and confining. Cass stood in the center of the room, his presence filling the space, making it seem even smaller. He looked around, his eyes taking in the details, the simple furnishings, the faded photograph of Jo and Daniel on the shelf. It's different, he said, his voice neutral. Seeing it again, after he didn't finish the sentence, but Jo knew what he meant. Their journey had changed them, had forged a bond between them that had altered their perspectives, their expectations. Jo busied herself preparing a simple meal, her hands moving automatically, her mind racing. She was acutely aware of Cass's presence, of his every move, his every breath. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension, with the weight of their shared experiences and the uncertain future that lay ahead. As they ate, the silence was broken only by the clinking of their tin plates and the occasional crackle of the wood-burning stove. Jo found herself stealing glances at Cass, studying his face, his hands, the way he held himself. She was drawn to him, to his strength, his vulnerability, his enigmatic nature. "What will you do now?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. "About the debt?" Cass leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting hers. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice firm. "I told you I always collect my debts. And I always pay them." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they sent a shiver of apprehension down Jo's spine. She knew that handling it could mean many things, and some of those things were dangerous.
"How?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cass smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I have my ways," he said.
"Don't worry about it."
Jo wanted to press him, to demand details, but she knew it was futile. He wouldn't reveal his plans, not until he was ready. She had to trust him, to believe that he would keep his promise, even if it meant putting himself at risk. As the evening wore on, the tension between them grew, becoming almost unbearable. They were caught between a rock and a hard place, between the past they couldn't escape and the future they couldn't predict. They were drawn to each other, yet held back by fear, by uncertainty, by the weight of their individual burdens. Finally, as the clock ticked towards midnight, Jo made a decision. She stood up, her heart pounding in her chest, and walked over to Cass. She stood before him, her gaze unwavering, her chin lifted in defiance. "I'm tired of running," she said, her voice firm. "I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of letting other people make my choices for me." Cass looked at her, his blue eyes searching hers. He didn't speak, but his gaze was intense, questioning. Jo reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was warm and strong, calloused from years of hard work and handling cards. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, a surge of desire that surprised her with its intensity. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I know this. I want to face it with you. I want to take a gamble." A flicker of surprise crossed Cass's face, followed by a slow, widening smile. He squeezed her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Are you sure, Jo?" he asked, his voice low and husky. "This isn't a game. This is real." Jo nodded, her heart overflowing with a mixture of fear and excitement.
"I'm sure," she said.
"I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He stood up, pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. She leaned into him, her body molding against his, feeling the warmth of his embrace, the strength of his presence. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. Jo responded, her lips parting beneath his, welcoming him, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense, a release of all the pent-up tension, all the unspoken desires that had been simmering between them. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a choice made, a gamble taken. It was a moment of surrender, of vulnerability, of trust. Between the rock of their past and the hard place of their future, they had chosen each other. The decision was made, the die was cast. The consequences, whatever they might be, would be faced together. Chapter 11. The gathering storm, the brewing conflict. The days following their shared moment of intimacy were filled with a quiet intensity, a sense of anticipation that hung heavy in the air. Cass spent his days discreetly making inquiries around town, gathering information about Daniel's creditors, a shadowy group known as the Shadow Riders. Jo, meanwhile, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, tending to her garden, mending clothes, and offering a helping hand to her neighbors. But beneath the surface, she was a whirlwind of emotions, torn between her growing feelings for Cass and her fear of the impending confrontation. Cass revealed little about his plans, But Joe sensed a growing tension in him, a tightening of his jaw, a sharpening of his gaze. He was preparing for battle, both literally and figuratively. He cleaned and oiled his guns, his movements precise and practiced, a ritual that spoke of his familiarity with violence and his readiness to use it. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, Cass finally spoke about what he'd learned. "The Shadow Riders are led by a man named Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice low and grim. "He's a ruthless, cold-blooded killer, with a reputation for collecting debts in the most brutal way possible." Jo shivered, her heart filled with dread. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cass met her gaze, his blue eyes intense. "I'll meet with him," he said. "I'll try to negotiate a settlement." Jo knew that negotiate was a euphemism for something far more dangerous. She wanted to beg him not to go, to find another way, but she knew it was futile. He was a man of his word, and he had made a promise.
"When?"
she asked, her voice trembling slightly.
"Tomorrow," Cass said.
"At dawn." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent promise of protection. "Don't worry," he said, his voice soft. "I'll be careful." Jo wanted to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. She knew that Silas Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with, and that Cass was walking into a trap. That night, Jo couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, listening to Cass's steady breathing in the next room, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She was terrified of losing him, of the thought of him facing Blackwood alone. As the first rays of dawn crept through the window, Jo rose and dressed, her movements quiet and deliberate. She couldn't stay behind, couldn't let Cass face this danger alone. She had to be there, even if it meant putting herself at risk. She found Cass outside, saddling Diablo, his face set in a grim expression. He looked surprised to see her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I'm going with you," Jo said, her voice firm. Cass frowned.
"No," he said.
"It's too dangerous."
"I don't care," Jo said.
"I won't let you face this alone." They argued, their voices low and intense, a clash of wills in the quiet dawn. But Jo was adamant, her determination unwavering. She had made her choice, had taken her gamble, and she wouldn't back down now. Finally, Cass relented, his expression softening. He knew he couldn't dissuade her, that her stubbornness matched his own. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "But you stay behind me, and you do exactly what I say." Jo nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. She mounted her horse, her hands trembling slightly, and they rode out together, towards the gathering storm, towards the brewing conflict that would determine their fate. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, a silent witness to their courage, their love, and their shared determination to face whatever lay ahead. The rising sun cast long shadows, a metaphor for the darkness they were riding towards and the uncertainty that awaited them. Chapter 12. Secrets Unveiled, Truths Revealed. The meeting place was an abandoned mine shaft on the outskirts of town, a desolate, eerie location that seemed to foreshadow the grim nature of the encounter. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and decay, and the silence was broken only by the occasional caw of a raven circling overhead. Cass and Jo dismounted, their horses tethered to a scraggly mesquite bush. Jo stayed close to Cass, her hand resting on the small pistol he'd insisted she carry, her heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the surroundings, her eyes searching for any sign of movement, any indication of danger. The mine shaft entrance was a gaping black hole in the side of the hill, a symbol of the darkness they were about to enter. Cass took a deep breath, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'll go in alone." Jo wanted to protest, but she knew he was right. She would be a liability inside the mine, a distraction he couldn't afford. She nodded, her throat tight with fear. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Cass touched her cheek, his fingers lingering for a moment, his gaze intense. "I will," he said. "I promise." He turned and disappeared into the darkness of the mine shaft, leaving Joe alone in the desolate silence. She waited, her senses on high alert, her every nerve tingling with apprehension. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each one an agonizing test of her patience and her courage. She heard muffled voices, the sound of a struggle, a gunshot that echoed through the stillness. Her heart leaped into her throat, her blood turning to ice. She wanted to run into the mine, to help Cass, but she knew she couldn't. She had to trust him, to believe that he could handle the situation. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Cass emerged from the mine shaft, his face grim, his clothes covered in dust. He was alone. What happened? Joe asked, her voice trembling. Where's Blackwood? Cass didn't answer immediately. He walked towards her, his eyes searching hers, his expression unreadable. It's complicated, he finally said, his voice strained. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book, handing it to Joe. It was a ledger, filled with names and numbers, a record of debts and payments. This is Blackwood's ledger, Cass said. It contains information. Information about your brother. Joe took the ledger, her fingers trembling. She opened it, her eyes scanning the pages, searching for Daniel's name. She found it, listed among dozens of others, the amount he owed clearly marked. But there was something else. Beside Daniel's name, in a different handwriting, was a notation, paid in full. Joe looked up at Cass, confused. What does this mean? She asked. Cass took a deep breath, his gaze meeting hers. It means, he said, his voice low and intense, that Daniel's debt was already paid. Before I ever got involved. Joe's heart stopped. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. How is that possible? Cass explained, his words revealing a truth that was both shocking and devastating. Daniel hadn't been running from Blackwood, he'd been running from something else, someone else. He'd used Joe, manipulated her, played on her loyalty and her love to get what he wanted. He knew the debt was paid, Cass said. He used you to get more money, to fund his escape. The truth hit Joe like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. She'd been betrayed, not just by Daniel, but by her own blindness, her own unwavering belief in her brother's goodness. I don't understand, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Why would he do this? Cass shrugged, his expression sympathetic. He's a gambler, Joe, he said. He's always looking for the next big score, the next easy way out. He doesn't care who he hurts in the process. The revelation was a crushing blow, shattering Joe's illusions, forcing her to confront the painful reality of her brother's true nature. But it was also a liberation, freeing her from the burden of guilt and responsibility she'd carried for so long. Secrets were unveiled, and with it some painful truths. But Blackwood? Joe struggled the question through the lump in her throat. Cass's expression turned dark. Blackwood was playing his own game, keeping 2 sets of books. He was going to come after you, Joe, for the money he claimed Daniel still owed. He knew about you, about the homestead. Joe felt a chill. She'd been a pawn in not 1, but 2 deceitful games. Cass continued. He's dealt with. He won't be bothering anyone ever again. The finality in his voice spoke volumes. The weight of the truth, the betrayal, and the danger she'd unknowingly been in settled upon her. But amidst the turmoil, a new understanding began to dawn. She looked at Cass, not as a gambler, not as a savior, but as a man who had risked his life to protect her, to uncover the truth, even when it was painful. The mine shaft stood silent, a monument to the secrets it had held and the truths it had revealed. The brewing storm had broken, and in its wake, a new landscape of understanding began to emerge. Chapter 13. A test of loyalty, a trial of faith. The revelation of Daniel's deceit left Joe reeling, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and a profound sense of loss. She'd spent her life caring for her brother, sacrificing her own happiness for his, and now she realized it had all been a lie. Cass watched her, his expression filled with a mixture of sympathy and something else. Something that looked almost like admiration. He knew the pain she was feeling, the sting of betrayal, the crushing weight of disillusionment. "I'm sorry, Joe," he said, his voice soft. "I know this is hard." Joe shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know what to do," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I feel lost." Cass reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm and reassuring, a grounding presence in the midst of her emotional turmoil. "You're not lost, Joe," he said, his voice firm. "You're free. Free from Daniel, free from his lies, free from the burden you've been carrying." His words resonated with a truth that Joe was slowly beginning to grasp. She'd been living in a prison of her own making, bound by loyalty to a brother who didn't deserve it. Now, the chains were broken, and she was free to choose her own path. But freedom came with its own challenges. She had to rebuild her life, to find a new purpose, a new direction. And she had to decide what to do about Cass, about the feelings she had for him, feelings that were growing stronger every day. "What about you?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "What will you do now?" Cass shrugged, his usual smirk returning, but it was a softer, more genuine expression now. "I'll stay here," he said. "In redemption. For a while at least." Joe's heart skipped a beat.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He met her gaze, his blue eyes intense. "Because," he said, his voice low and husky, "I made a promise."
"To you."
"And I intend to keep it." His words sent a warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling of hope, of possibility. She realized that his promise wasn't just about Daniel's debt, it was about something more, something deeper. It was about his commitment to her, to their burgeoning relationship. But even as she felt a surge of happiness, a flicker of doubt remained. Could she trust him? Could she trust her own feelings? She'd been betrayed before, and the scars were still fresh. As they rode back to town, a new challenge arose, a test of their loyalty and their faith in each other. A group of riders appeared on the horizon, approaching them at a rapid pace. It was Sheriff Thompson and his deputies, their faces grim, their guns drawn. "Cass Rollins," the sheriff shouted, his voice booming across the open space. "You're under arrest." Joe's heart leaped into her throat. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice filled with alarm. Cass remained calm, his expression unreadable. "It's Blackwood's men," he said, his voice low. "They've accused me of killing him." The sheriff and his deputies surrounded them, their guns pointed at Cass. "Drop your weapon, Rollins," the sheriff ordered. Cass slowly dismounted, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He looked at Joe, his eyes conveying a silent message. "Trust me." Joe wanted to protest, to defend Cass, but she knew she couldn't. She was outnumbered, outgunned. She had to trust that Cass could handle the situation, that he could prove his innocence. The sheriff and his deputies took Cass into custody, ignoring Joe's pleas and protests. They rode off, leaving her alone and heartbroken, watching as the man she was starting to love was taken away, accused of a crime she knew he hadn't committed, at least, not in cold blood. Joe was left standing there, in the middle of the vast, empty landscape, her heart filled with a mixture of fear, anger, and a fierce determination. She wouldn't let them take Cass, wouldn't let them destroy the fragile hope they had found together. She would fight for him, just as he had fought for her. She would prove his innocence, even if it meant facing down the entire town, even if it meant risking her own life. A trial of faith lay before her, a test of her loyalty to Cass, and his to her, though unspoken and unseen, was about to begin. The dust swirled around her, a reminder of the challenges ahead and the strength she would need to overcome them. Chapter 14. The thin line between love and hate. The news of Cass's arrest spread through Redemption like wildfire, fueling the town's already simmering prejudice against outsiders and gamblers. Joe found herself facing a wall of suspicion and hostility, her attempts to defend Cass met with scorn and disbelief. She went to the sheriff's office, demanding to see Cass, but Thompson refused, his face set in a mask of righteous indignation. "He's a murderer, Joe," he said, his voice cold. "He killed Silas Blackwood in cold blood. He'll hang for it." Joe argued, pleaded, even threatened, but the sheriff remained unmoved. He was convinced of Cass's guilt, swayed by the testimony of Blackwood's men, who had painted Cass as a ruthless killer who had ambushed their boss.
Joe knew it was a lie.
She'd seen the ledger, had heard Cass's explanation of what had happened at the mine. But she had no proof, no way to convince the sheriff or anyone else in town of the truth. She visited Cass in his jail cell, a small, dark, and damp enclosure that reeked of despair. He sat on the narrow cot, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and resignation. "They won't listen to me, Joe," he said, his voice low and weary. "They've already made up their minds." Joe reached through the bars, taking his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His touch was cold, his grip weak. "I believe you, Cass," she said, her voice firm. "I know you didn't do it. I'll find a way to prove it." Cass looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes.
"How?"
he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They have witnesses, they have the body." Joe didn't know how, but she was determined to find a way. She would scour the town, talk to everyone, search for any shred of evidence that could clear Cass's name. She spent the next few days doing just that, facing down the hostility and suspicion of the townspeople, her determination fueled by her love for Cass and her unwavering belief in his innocence. She questioned everyone who might have seen or heard anything, from the saloon owner to the stable boy, but her efforts were met with silence, or worse, outright lies. She discovered that Blackwood had been a hated man, feared and resented by many in town. He had been a ruthless loan shark, preying on the vulnerable, using violence and intimidation to collect his debts. But no one was willing to speak out against him, even in death, for fear of retaliation from his remaining men. Joe felt like she was walking a thin line between love and hate, between her love for Cass and the town's hatred of him. She was an outsider now, just like him, viewed with suspicion and distrust. One evening, as she was returning to her homestead, exhausted and disheartened, she found Martha, the general store owner, waiting for her. Martha had always been a friend, a confidant, but even she seemed hesitant, unsure. "Joe," Martha said, her voice low and cautious. "I heard something. Something that might help Cass." Joe's heart leaped with hope. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Martha hesitated, looking around nervously. "It's about Blackwood," she said. "About how he died. There's a rumor that he wasn't killed at the mine, that he was killed somewhere else, and his body was moved there." Joe's mind raced. This could be the break she needed, the evidence that could prove Cass's innocence. "Who told you this?" she asked, her voice urgent. Martha shook her head. "I can't say," she said.
"I'm afraid."
Blackwood's men, they're still around. They're watching everyone. Joe understood Martha's fear. She was risking her own safety by even talking to Joe. "But there's someone who might know more," Martha continued. "Old Man Hemlock. He lives out by the old graveyard. He sees things, hears things, he might know the truth." Joe thanked Martha, her heart filled with a renewed sense of hope. Old Man Hemlock was a recluse, a strange, eccentric character who lived on the fringes of society. He was considered a bit mad by most of the townspeople, but Joe knew that sometimes the mad saw things that others didn't. She was putting her faith and Cass's on very shaky ground, but it was all she had. She resolved to visit Hemlock the next morning, to seek his help in uncovering the truth, in saving the man she loved. The thin line she walked was about to get even thinner. Chapter 15. Riding the edge of ruin and redemption. The journey to Old Man Hemlock's shack was a solitary one, filled with a mixture of trepidation and determination. Joe rode through the early morning mist, the landscape shrouded in an eerie silence, her thoughts consumed by the task ahead. She knew she was taking a risk, placing her trust in a man who was considered an outcast, a madman. But she had no other choice. Cass's life depended on it. Hemlock Shack was a dilapidated structure, perched precariously on a rocky outcrop overlooking the old graveyard, a fitting location for a man who was said to commune with the dead. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something indefinable, something that sent a shiver down Joe's spine. She dismounted, tethering her horse to a gnarled, twisted tree that looked like it had been struck by lightning. She approached the shack cautiously, her hand resting on the pistol Cass had given her, her heart pounding in her chest. The door creaked open before she could knock, revealing a wizened old man with wild, unkempt hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. This was Old Man Hemlock, the keeper of secrets, the witness to the hidden truths of redemption. "You seek knowledge," Hemlock said, his voice raspy and cracked, like the rustling of dry leaves. "You seek justice." Joe nodded, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and hope. "I seek the truth," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "About Silas Blackwood's death." Hemlock studied her for a moment, his gaze intense, unsettling. He seemed to be weighing her, judging her worthiness. "The truth is a dangerous thing," he said. "It can bring salvation, or it can bring ruin." "I'm not afraid," Joe said, her voice firmer now. "I need to know what happened. I need to save an innocent man." Hemlock nodded, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his eyes. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to allow her to enter. The interior of the shack was dark and cluttered, filled with strange objects, bones, feathers, dried herbs, and other artifacts that Joe couldn't identify. The air was thick with the scent of incense and decay, creating an atmosphere that was both mystical and unsettling. Hemlock motioned for her to sit on a rickety stool while he settled himself on a pile of tattered blankets in the corner. He lit a small, smoky fire. The Flickering Flames, Chapter 16. When all seems lost, hope flickers. Continuing directly from the previous chapter's abrupt ending, casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the strange objects that adorned the shack, giving them an almost animate quality. Joe sat tensely, her gaze fixed on Hemlock, her senses on high alert. "Silas Blackwood," Hemlock began, his voice a low, hypnotic drone. "A man of darkness, a collector of souls. He met his end, not in the mine, as they say, but in the saloon." Joe's heart leaped. This was the confirmation she'd been seeking, the proof that Cass was innocent. "The lucky horseshoe?" she asked, her voice urgent. Hemlock nodded. "A quarrel, a fight, a hidden blade. He died quickly, but not cleanly." He paused, his eyes gazing into the flames, as if seeing the events unfold before him. "His men, they panicked. They feared retribution. They moved the body to the mine, to frame another." "Cass Rollins," Joe said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and relief. Hemlock nodded again. "The gambler, a convenient scapegoat. But he is innocent. Of that crime, at least." Joe needed to know more, needed details that could convince the sheriff, that could clear Cass's name. "Who killed him?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who in the saloon saw what happened?" Hemlock was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting from the fire to Joe, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and warning. "The killer walks among you," he said, his voice cryptic. "A wolf in sheep's clothing. A man of influence. A man of secrets." Joe's mind raced. Who in redemption fit that description? Who had the power, the influence, to orchestrate such a deception? "The witnesses, they are afraid," Hemlock continued. "They have been silenced. By fear, by bribes, by threats." Joe felt a surge of frustration, of despair. How could she break through this wall of silence? How could she expose the truth? "There is one," Hemlock said, his voice barely a whisper. "One who might speak. One who saw everything." Joe leaned forward, her heart pounding with anticipation. "Who?" she asked, her voice desperate. Hemlock hesitated, his eyes darting around the shack, as if afraid of being overheard, even in this isolated place. "The piano player," he finally said. "At the Lucky Horseshoe. He sees everything. He hears everything. But he is afraid. He needs convincing." Joe felt a flicker of hope, a renewed sense of determination. The piano player. He was the key, the witness who could unlock the truth, who could save Cass. She thanked Hemlock, her heart filled with gratitude for his help, for his willingness to share his knowledge, despite the risk. She left the shack, her mind racing, Her resolve strengthened. As she rode back towards redemption, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The sky was ablaze with color, a beautiful spectacle that mirrored the turmoil of emotions within her. She was riding towards a confrontation, a showdown with the forces of darkness that had conspired to frame Cass. She knew the risks were great, that she was facing powerful enemies, men who wouldn't hesitate to silence her permanently. But she was no longer afraid. She was driven by love, by loyalty, by a fierce determination to see justice done. She reached redemption as darkness fell, the town shrouded in an eerie silence. The Lucky Horseshoe Saloon was still open, its lights spilling out into the street, a beacon of false cheer in the midst of the gathering storm. Jo dismounted, tethering her horse to the hitching post. She took a deep breath, steeling her resolve. She walked towards the saloon, her hand resting on the pistol Cass had given her, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed open the batwing doors, stepping into the smoky, dimly lit interior. The piano player was at his usual post, hammering out a mournful tune, his eyes downcast, his expression weary. The saloon was sparsely populated, a few patrons nursing their drinks, their faces etched with a mixture of boredom and despair. Jo walked towards the piano, her steps deliberate, her gaze fixed on the piano player. He looked up as she approached, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in fear. He knew why she was there. He knew what she wanted. The fate of Cass Rollins, the fate of Jo Hollis, and the fate of redemption itself hung in the balance, resting on the testimony of a frightened piano player, a man who had seen too much, who knew the truth, but was afraid to speak it. Hope flickered, fragile but persistent, in the smoky air of the Lucky Horseshoe Saloon. The moment of truth had arrived. Chapter 17. The Devil's Bargain, the Angel's Grace. Jo stood before the piano player, her presence silencing the already subdued murmur of the saloon. The air was thick with tension, the scent of stale beer and fear mingling with the lingering notes of the mournful tune. The piano player, a thin, nervous man named Benny, avoided her gaze, his fingers still hovering over the keys, as if poised to resume playing at any moment. "Benny," Jo said, her voice low but firm. "I need to talk to you. About Silas Blackwood." Benny's hands trembled, his eyes darting around the saloon, as if searching for an escape. He didn't speak, his silence a testament to his fear. "I know you saw what happened," Jo continued. "I know you saw who killed him." Benny finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and pleading. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "He's afraid, Jo," a voice drawled from behind her. Jo turned to see Sheriff Thompson standing there, his face grim, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He was flanked by two of Blackwood's men, their expressions menacing, their presence a clear threat. "This has gone far enough," Thompson said, his voice cold. "You're interfering with an investigation, harassing witnesses. I'm placing you under arrest." Jo stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was in a dangerous situation, surrounded by enemies, with no one to turn to for help. "I'm not harassing anyone," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "I'm seeking the truth. Benny knows who killed Blackwood. He saw it happen." Thompson scoffed. "Benny doesn't know anything," he said. "He's a drunk, a coward. He'll say whatever we tell him to say." He turned to Benny, his voice hardening. "Isn't that right, Benny?" Benny flinched, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at Jo, then at Thompson, then at Blackwood's men, his body trembling. He was caught in a trap, forced to choose between telling the truth and saving his own skin. Jo knew she had to act fast, had to find a way to break through Benny's fear, to convince him to speak out. "Benny," she said, her voice pleading. "Please. An innocent man's life is at stake. Cass Rollins is going to hang for a crime he didn't commit. You're the only one who can save him." Benny hesitated, his eyes flickering between Jo and Thompson. He looked at the faces of Blackwood's men, their expressions cold and unforgiving. He knew what they were capable of, what they would do to him if he betrayed them. But he also saw something in Jo's eyes, something that gave him a flicker of courage, a spark of hope. He saw her determination, her unwavering belief in Cass's innocence, her willingness to risk everything to save him. He took a deep breath, his body still trembling, but his voice surprisingly firm. "I saw it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw who killed Blackwood." Thompson's face turned pale, his eyes widening in disbelief. Blackwood's men shifted uneasily, their hands moving towards their guns. "You're lying," Thompson said, his voice shaking. "You're just trying to protect Rollins." Benny shook his head. "No," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I saw it." He paused, his eyes darting around the saloon, finally settling on a figure standing in the shadows near the bar. A man who had been watching the scene unfold with a cold, detached expression. A man of influence, a man of secrets. It was Sheriff Thompson, Benny said, his voice clear and strong. The saloon erupted in chaos. Thompson's face turned crimson, his eyes blazing with fury. Blackwood's men lunged towards Benny, their guns drawn. But before they could reach him, a shot rang out. One of Blackwood's men crumpled to the floor, a bullet hole in his chest. Everyone turned to see Cass Rollins standing in the doorway, his gun smoking, his expression grim. He had escaped from jail, somehow, and had come to Joe's rescue, just as she had come to his. The remaining Blackwood man turned to face Cass, his gun raised. But Cass was faster. Another shot rang out, and the man fell, his body hitting the floor with a thud. The saloon was silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the stunned patrons. Cass walked towards Thompson, his gun still trained on him. "It's over, Thompson," Cass said, his voice cold. "You're finished." Thompson, his face pale with fear, slowly lowered his gun. He knew he was defeated, his carefully constructed lies exposed, his power shattered. He had made a devil's bargain, and now the price was due. Joe ran toward Cass, embracing him and burying her face in his chest. You came back." Joe gasped through her sobs. Cass tightened his grip around her. "I told you. I always collect and pay my debts." With Thompson's confession, extracted with Cass's persuasion, the truth was finally revealed. Thompson, deeply in debt to Blackwood, had killed him in a desperate attempt to escape his financial ruin. He had then used his position as sheriff to frame Cass, hoping to eliminate the gambler and seize Joe's homestead, which he believed held a hidden cache of gold, a rumor spread by Daniel in his twisted scheme. But Thompson's plan had failed, undone by Joe's unwavering faith in Cass, by Benny's courageous testimony, and by Cass's own determination to clear his name and protect the woman he loved. A devil's bargain had been exposed, and an angel's grace, in the form of Joe's unwavering love and loyalty, had prevailed. The storm had passed, the darkness had lifted, and a new dawn was breaking over redemption. Chapter 18. Confronting the Demons, Embracing the Dawn. With Sheriff Thompson's confession and arrest, a wave of relief washed over redemption, followed by a sense of shame and disillusionment. The town had been betrayed by one of its own, a man they had trusted to uphold the law, to protect them from harm. Cass was exonerated, his name cleared, but the scars of his ordeal remained. He had been falsely accused, imprisoned, and nearly hanged for a crime he didn't commit. He had faced the darkness of human nature, the ugliness of greed and betrayal. Joe stood by him, her love and support unwavering, a beacon of hope in the midst of his turmoil. She understood his pain, his anger, his need for healing. She had faced her own demons, her own betrayals, and she knew that the road to recovery would be long and difficult. They spent the following days in quiet seclusion at Joe's homestead, tending to the wounds, both physical and emotional, that had been inflicted upon them. They talked, they cried, they shared their fears and their hopes, their pasts and their dreams. Cass revealed more about his life before he became a gambler, about his family, his ranch, the loss that had driven him to seek solace in risk and escape. He spoke of his wife, Sarah, who had died of a fever, leaving him heartbroken and adrift. He spoke of his son, a young boy he had been forced to leave behind, entrusting him to the care of his wife's sister. Joe listened, her heart aching for the pain he had endured, for the losses he had suffered. She shared her own stories, her own struggles, her own dreams that had been deferred, her own sacrifices that had been made in vain. They found solace in each other's company, in their shared understanding of loss and resilience, in their growing love for each other. They were two broken souls, finding healing in each other's arms, finding strength in each other's presence. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues, Cass turned to Joe, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and resolve. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and hesitant, "about the future, about us." Joe's heart skipped a beat. She had been hoping for this, dreaming of this, but she had also been afraid to voice her desires, afraid of rejection, afraid of disappointment. "What about us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Cass took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent promise of commitment. "I want to stay here," he said, his voice firm. "In redemption. With you. If you'll have me." Tears welled up in Joe's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming happiness. She nodded, unable to speak, her heart overflowing with love. Cass smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes, erasing the shadows of the past, illuminating the promise of the future. "I want to build a life here," he continued. "With you. A new life. A life based on honesty, on trust, on love." He paused, his gaze searching hers, seeking her reassurance, her acceptance. "I know I'm not perfect," he said. "I have baggage. I have scars. But I'm willing to work at it. To be the man you deserve. If you'll give me a chance." Joe reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his face, the scars that told the story of his life. "You don't have to be perfect, Cass," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You just have to be you. And I love you, just the way you are." He pulled her close, embracing her tightly, his body trembling with emotion. She leaned into him, her heart overflowing with love, with gratitude, with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. They had confronted their demons, embraced the dawn, and found their way to each other, their love a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West. They had found redemption, not in escaping the past, but in facing it, in learning from it, in building a future together, a future filled with love, with trust, with the promise of a new beginning. The demons of their pasts had been confronted, and the dawn of a new life, a shared life, was breaking, bright and beautiful, over the horizon. Chapter 19. Blood on the sand, tears in the dust. The peace that Joe and Cass found was shattered, as peace often is in the unforgiving West, by a ghost from the past. A rider, dust-caked and desperate, arrived in redemption bearing a message, a plea for help. It was from Daniel. Joe's heart sank as she read the crumpled letter, her brother's familiar scrawl a painful reminder of his betrayal. He was in trouble, again, deeper than ever before. He'd fallen in with a new gang, even more ruthless than Blackwood's, and he'd crossed them, cheated them, stolen from them. Now, they were hunting him, and he was begging Joe to save him, one last time. Cass watched Joe's face as she read the letter, his expression hardening with each passing moment. He knew what this meant, what Daniel was asking of her, what it would cost them. "He's using you again, Joe," Cass said, his voice cold. "He doesn't deserve your help." Joe looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, resentment, and obligation. She knew Cass was right, that Daniel was manipulating her, playing on her loyalty, her sense of responsibility. But he was still her brother, and she couldn't just abandon him, couldn't leave him to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how much he deserved it. "I know," she said, her voice weary, "but I can't just let him die." Cass sighed, running a hand through his hair. He understood her dilemma, her conflict, her sense of duty. He had faced his own demons, his own obligations, and he knew that sometimes the ties of family, no matter how strained, were impossible to ignore. "What does he want?" Cass asked, his voice resigned. "He wants money," Joe said. "Enough to disappear." To start over, somewhere else. Cass scoffed. He'll never start over, he said. He'll just find a new way to get himself into trouble. I know, Joe said. But maybe this time, maybe if he gets away from this gang, maybe he'll change. Cass didn't believe it, and Joe wasn't sure she did either. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to try, one last time, to save her brother, even if it meant risking everything she had found with Cass. They argued, their voices low and intense, a clash of wills and emotions in the quiet confines of the homestead. Cass pleaded with her to let Daniel go, to focus on their future, on their happiness. But Joe was adamant. Her sense of responsibility, her ingrained habit of caring for her brother, overriding her own desires. Finally, Cass relented, his expression softening. He knew he couldn't change her mind, that her love for her brother, no matter how misguided, was a part of who she was. All right, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. I'll help you. But this is the last time, Joe. The last time we risk our lives for him. Joe nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She knew he was right, that this had to be the end of it, that she couldn't keep sacrificing her own happiness for Daniel's recklessness. They gathered the money, a significant portion of their savings, the funds they had planned to use to start their new life together. It was a painful sacrifice, a bitter reminder of the hold Daniel still had over her. They rode out to meet Daniel, the rendezvous point a desolate canyon on the outskirts of town. The air was heavy with tension, with the premonition of danger. They were walking into a trap, and they both knew it. They found Daniel waiting for them, his face pale and haggard, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. He looked relieved to see them, but there was also a flicker of guilt, of shame, in his expression. Joe, he said, his voice trembling. Thank you. I owe you everything. Joe didn't respond, her heart filled with a mixture of resentment and pity. She handed him the money, her hand shaking. This is it, Daniel, she said, her voice firm. The last time. Don't ever contact me again. Daniel nodded, his eyes avoiding hers. He took the money, his fingers clutching it greedily. I won't, he said. I promise. I'll make a new life for myself. I'll change. But as he turned to leave, a group of riders appeared on the canyon rim, their silhouettes stark against the setting sun. It was the gang Daniel had crossed, their leader a cruel, ruthless man named Razor Reno, known for his penchant for violence and his skill with a knife. Well, Reno drawled, his voice dripping with menace. Looks like we have a family reunion. Daniel froze, his face turning ashen. He looked at Joe and Cass, his eyes filled with terror. He knew he was trapped, that his lies and his betrayals had finally caught up with him. You set us up, Daniel, Joe said, her voice filled with anger and despair. Daniel didn't deny it. He knew it was over. He'd played his last hand, and he'd lost. Reno and his men rode down into the canyon. A fight was inevitable. This is between me and Daniel, Cass told Joe. Stay out of it. Before Joe could reply, Reno spoke, the woman stays. She's part of the deal now. Daniel promised us more than just money. He promised us her.
Jokasper.
The depth of Daniel's betrayal was almost unfathomable. Cass's eyes blazed with fury. He drew his gun. The canyon erupted in gunfire. Cass, despite being outnumbered, fought with the skill and ferocity of a cornered lion, protecting Joe, defending her honor, his love for her fueling his rage. Joe, despite Cass's warning, didn't stay out of it. She picked up a dropped gun and fired, her aim surprisingly accurate, her determination fueled by years of pent-up frustration and a newfound sense of empowerment. But the odds were against them. Cass was wounded, a bullet grazing his arm, another piercing his side. Joe was knocked to the ground, her head striking a rock, her vision blurring. Daniel, seeing his chance to escape, tried to run, but Reno caught him, his knife flashing in the fading light. Daniel screamed, his body slumping to the ground, his lifeblood staining the sand. Joe, seeing her brother fall, cried out, her heart breaking, despite everything. She crawled towards him, her vision swimming, her body aching. Cass, seeing Joe in danger, fought his way towards her, his gun blazing, his determination unwavering. He reached her, shielding her with his body, firing at Reno, forcing him to retreat. But it was too late. Daniel was dead, and Cass was gravely wounded. Blood on the sand, tears in the dust. The price of loyalty, the cost of betrayal, had been paid in full. The canyon fell silent, the echoes of gunfire fading, replaced by the mournful whisper of the wind. The sun had set, leaving them in darkness, a darkness that mirrored the despair in Joe's heart. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Joe knelt beside Cass, her hands trembling as she tried to staunch the bleeding from his wounds. He was pale and weak, his breathing shallow, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and love. "Joe," he whispered, his voice barely audible.
"I'm sorry."
"Don't talk," Joe said, tears streaming down her face. "Save your strength." She ripped strips of cloth from her dress, her hands working frantically, trying to stop the flow of blood. She had to get him back to redemption, to a doctor, to safety. But she knew it was a long shot. He was badly wounded, and the journey was arduous. She didn't know if he would make it. She managed to get him onto his horse, supporting his weight, her body aching with exertion and fear. She mounted her own horse, holding Cass close, guiding them slowly, carefully, towards town. The journey was a nightmare, a blur of pain, fear, and desperate hope. Joe prayed, she pleaded, she bargained with whatever powers might be listening, begging them to spare Cass's life, to give them a chance at happiness. She reached redemption as dawn was breaking, the sky painted in hues of pink and gold, a cruel mockery of the darkness in her heart. She rode straight to the doctor's office, shouting for help, her voice hoarse with desperation. The doctor, a weary, grizzled man named Samuel, came rushing out, his eyes widening in alarm as he saw Cass's condition. He and Joe carried Cass inside, laying him on the examination table, the doctor's hands moving quickly, efficiently, assessing the damage. "He's lost a lot of blood," Samuel said, his voice grim. "I'll do what I can, but it's not good." Joe stood beside the table, her hand clasped tightly in Cass's, her eyes fixed on his face, willing him to live, to fight, to stay with her. The next few hours were an agony of waiting, of hoping, of praying. The doctor worked tirelessly, cleaning and stitching the wounds, trying to stabilize Cass's condition. Joe refused to leave his side, her presence a constant vigil, her love a silent plea. Finally, as the sun began to set, the doctor stepped back, his face etched with exhaustion and a flicker of hope. "He's stable," Samuel said, his voice weary. "He's a strong man, Joe. He's fighting, but he's not out of the woods yet." Joe felt a wave of relief wash over her, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. He was alive. He was fighting. There was still a chance. She sat beside Cass's bed, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall with each shallow breath. She spoke to him, softly, reassuringly, telling him how much she loved him, how much she needed him. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she hoped that her voice, her love, would reach him, would give him the strength to keep fighting. As the night deepened, Cass's condition began to improve. His breathing became stronger, his color returned, his eyes flickered open. He looked at Joe, his gaze weak but clear. "Joe," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm here, Cass," Joe said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here." He smiled, a weak but genuine smile. "We made it," he whispered. "We made it," Joe repeated, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. He had survived. They had survived. They had faced the final confrontation, the ultimate test of their love and their loyalty, and they had emerged, battered and bruised, but together. The road ahead would be long and difficult. Cass would need time to heal, to recover from his wounds. They would have to rebuild their lives, to find a new purpose, a new direction. But they would do it together. They had found something precious, something worth fighting for, something that transcended the pain and the loss, the darkness and the despair. They had found love, a love that had been tested by fire, a love that had endured, a love that would guide them towards a brighter future, a future filled with hope, with promise, with the unwavering certainty that they could face anything as long as they had each other. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons had been won, not with guns or violence, but with love, with loyalty, with the enduring power of the human spirit. The dawn was breaking, not just over redemption, but over their lives, a new beginning, a new chapter, a new promise of happiness. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of love. Cass made a full recovery, though the scars remained, a constant reminder of the battles they had fought, the sacrifices they had made. They rebuilt their lives, not in the shadow of the past, but in the light of a new beginning. They stayed in redemption, transforming the small, weathered homestead into a haven of peace and tranquility. Joe's garden flourished, a vibrant tapestry of colors and scents, a symbol of their renewed life. Cass, no longer a gambler, found a new purpose in working the land, in raising horses, in building a life based on honesty and hard work. They became pillars of the community, respected and admired for their strength, their integrity, their unwavering commitment to each other. They offered a helping hand to those in need, sharing their wisdom, their compassion, their hard-earned lessons. They never forgot Daniel, the brother who had betrayed them, the catalyst for their tumultuous journey. Joe mourned his loss, not for the man he had become, but for the boy he had once been, the brother she had loved and protected. She found a measure of peace in accepting his flaws, in forgiving his transgressions, in letting go of the past. Cass, too, found a measure of peace, reconciling with the ghosts of his own past, accepting the losses he had endured, embracing the new life he had found with Joe. He even, after many years, reconnected with his son, a young man who had grown up without a father, but who now welcomed Cass into his life with open arms. Their love deepened with each passing year, a bond forged in fire, tempered by adversity, strengthened by their shared experiences. They found joy in the simple things, in the quiet moments, in the shared laughter, in the unspoken understanding that passed between them. They often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunsets paint the sky in breathtaking hues, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude for the life they had built, for the love they had found. They had ridden through the storms, faced the demons, embraced the dawn, and found their way to a place of peace, of contentment, of enduring love. They had learned that life in the West, like life anywhere, was a gamble, a series of choices, a constant struggle between darkness and light. But they had also learned that love, true love, was the greatest prize of all, a treasure worth fighting for, a treasure that could conquer even the most formidable odds. Their story became a legend, whispered around campfires, told in saloons, a testament to the power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring promise of redemption in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the American West. The gambler's debt had been paid, not in gold, but in blood, tears, and ultimately, in the enduring currency of love. And in the quiet twilight of their lives, they knew they had won the greatest gamble of all. The end.